6th of January and we're still Parangins. It's 6 minutes after 7 o'clock in Trinidad and Tobago. Well, according to Attorney General Faris Al-Rawi, who spoke with political editor Joel Brown, there are multiple versions of laws already prepared for the government's plan to establish the public sector as safe zones. Concerns have been raised and rejections have also been forthcoming from unions representing those workers. The policy is set to take effect from January the 17th, that's the Monday, and many are anticipating a legal showdown if public workers fail to follow through with the government's new policy. Well, let's try to get another perspective, from someone who we usually discuss these legal matters with, Attorney at Law Martin George, not senior counsel, as we mentioned inadvertently the last time, just plain old Attorney at Law Martin George. Good morning to you, thanks for joining us.
Yes, good morning, Fazir. Good morning, and good morning to all your viewers, and Happy New Year to everyone. Just hearing Daisy's voice there, there must be beautiful music being made in heaven with herself, Kenny J, Bomber, and all the others who have passed, recently, so, we recognize the contributions that they have made.
Indeed, significant contributions in the entertainment space as well. So, how do you read this thing? Because we're waiting on the presentation of the legislation, and of course that is going to be properly assessed and so on. But what do you make of how this situation is developing as we head to January 17th?
Well, the thing is, Fazir, any way you cut it, slice it, or dice it, it appears that the legislation is coming, and notwithstanding the clever play on words that the government uses to try to avoid saying that it's mandatory vaccination, it really is an exercise in sophistry to try to say that it's not. It really is that, however you cloak it or mask it or disguise it. It really is that. But there's nothing wrong with that approach, because I'll tell you, since from 1905, in the U.S. case of Jacobson versus the state of Massachusetts, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that it was okay to have mandatory vaccinations for smallpox, right? Because this person in the state of Massachusetts, he filed an action claiming, it's a violation of his rights, etc. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they ruled that, look, it was legal to have that as part of the law in Massachusetts for mandatory smallpox vaccinations. And there are several cases from around the world that we can cite which show that there is precedent that always favors the greater good. I'll take you to the Czech Republic. In the case of Vavranica versus others versus the Czech Republic, this is a 2021 case. This is just from last year, right, where the European Court of Human Rights, right, so the highest court for human rights in the European Union, they had a matter before them where this claimant claimed that it was a violation of her rights to be forced to take the vaccine, right, for COVID-19. And the court ruled against her. They said that, look, in the circumstances, the state could mandate the vaccination, and the individual rights are subsumed to the rights of the society and the greater good. So there's always that balancing act. Nobody says that if you have a valid religious or a valid medical reason for not having the vaccine, that it will not be accepted. You, of course, make your case and it will be accepted once it is that it's valid. But if you don't have those reasons, then the courts have always tended to favor mandatory vaccination. And as I've always said, it's not rocket science, it's not magic. We have all been part of mandatory vaccinations in Trinidad and Tobago as school children in order to get into schools. Right? The public health legislation, which is part of our law already and has been part of our law for decades, that mandates that you must be vaccinated. All those vaccine shots you get as a baby from the time you're born, you're going to clinic, your parents taking you to clinic. What are you going there for? It's for mandatory vaccinations. You have things like diphtheria, tetanus, yellow fever, whooping cough, polio, smallpox, all these vaccines we took as children and we were given them. Nobody questioned to know, well, what is inside the polio vaccine, and I want to analyze it before I give my child. So, I mean, we really have to understand that we are living in an age where we have access to more and more information, and yet still the majority of people remain uninformed. And that's the challenge we have here in this scenario.
And given all that you've just said, are you satisfied that the government has presented a convincing case?
Well, the thing is, I think that their effort needs to be ramped up and they need to be more persuasive in their arguments in terms of the public relations element of it. I certainly think so, you know. And the fact of the matter is, while they do have the authority to do so, you still don't want to come across just with a big stick approach. So I think that definitely from the PR aspect, they can do better and they can make a more persuasive case to try to win over the hearts and minds of the population. Because at the end of the day, you want people to understand so that they can willingly, you know, take the vaccine rather than being herded like cattle, you know, and prodded, you know, and, you know, being injected by force, so to speak. You know, nobody wants that as your outcome. But at the end of the day, the law tends to always favor a scenario where the greater good is considered, and the courts always will rely on the science and the arguments presented by the scientists, which will show that, look, vaccination gives you a greater chance. It's not a bulletproof shield. We have to understand it. But the way you simply look at it, for instance, you at 36,000 feet in an aircraft, and the pilot says, look, folks, unfortunately, we're going to be crashing. Our engines have failed. We have parachutes for everybody. And can you imagine some passengers arguing and saying, well, parachutes don't work 100% of the time, so I don't want any parachute. Fazil, what would your choice be? Wouldn't you rather take the parachute and hope that it works rather than you argue foolishly that, well, yes, it has been proven that sometimes parachutes fail, or I don't know who made the parachute, or I don't know what material the parachute is made of, so therefore I'm not using the parachute. It's as stupid as that, sorry to say. You know, so we need to disaggregate, you know, sense from nonsense and the factual matrix of the scientific data, as opposed to, as you know, the Minister of Health loves to refer to them, the Facebook scientists.
And you know, Martin George, those who remain against this idea will say that you are representing the same level of arrogance and being dismissive and making fun of people who will say that they are human beings like you, and that they have rights and they have issues and concerns that haven't been adequately addressed either by the authorities or by science, and making fun of them only makes the situation even worse and more polarized.
Well, first, you know, it's not a question of making fun of them. It's a question of you juxtapose the scientific data, which persons who have, you know, been trained in this, they've been doing this for years in laboratories, as opposed to someone sitting at home in their jockey shorts, 3 o'clock in the morning on Facebook, and they're saying, well, look, what they read on Facebook, they rely on that more. I'm sorry. I mean, I would prefer to go with the scientific data. So it's not making fun of anybody. It's just the factual reality.
I'm trying to regain my composure. I'm trying to imagine somebody sitting down in the jockey shorts. This is what you cause. But when we talk about coping with this situation, I mean, we see what is happening in France. Emmanuel Macron has said that he intends to make life very difficult for those who are unvaccinated. I can't imagine the outrage if Keith Rowley wake up this morning, whether he wear any jockey shorts or not, and say something like that. So
now you have me laughing. But look, even in Amsterdam, you know, I mean, in the Netherlands, the government there is facing tremendous backlash against their policies. And remember, the Prime Minister announced it just before Christmas, and he said, unfortunately, it's the worst time of the year. It's the worst announcement he has to make, but he imposed even more serious measures and lockdowns just before Christmas. You had mass demonstrations over the weekend in Amsterdam. I mean, the police were very restrained in terms of how they dealt with them. But the fact of the matter is, you do have persons who, for whatever reason, they feel very strongly against it. And while you have to respect their views and their feelings, you must not necessarily be persuaded by it. You see, it's a different thing to, I can respect your view, so in other words, you may come with an idiotic proposal or principle or idea, and I respect your view because you really genuinely believe that. But certainly you are never going to persuade me.
But I hear you on that. And as we talk about, the greater good, can that be argued, well, who is the greater here? Because if the fully vaccinated are less than half, then it means that those who are in the majority are those who are unvaccinated, whatever the science says. And they say, well, okay, you want to go a particular way, but what about us? We are the majority.
Right, but the thing is, notice it's two words, greater good. So it's not the greater mass of idiots. It's the greater good that the courts look at, And I mean, I say that guardedly, Fazil. And when I say that, the courts will always look at what is the scientific data presented, right? And let's understand something. Science is not always right. Science is a learning curve. Remember, years ago, scientists told us that, the earth was the center of the universe and that the sun, was not the center of the universe. If you understand me.
Yes,
so therefore, we, as we learn more, as we gain more knowledge, and as we do more experiments, more testing, of course, things do change. Look, even the responses of governments all around the world has been, basically it's a moving target for zero. It's a moving target because the virus is now mutating. A new one was discovered this week. A new strain was discovered this week, So the fact of the matter is that we have to understand that the science is not perfect. Dr. Anthony Fauci has admitted that candidly several times, right? The CDC has also, expressed that view. The science is never perfect, but sometimes you have to go with the best option at the time and what your state of knowledge and understanding is, and you go with that as your best guide, as to what works for now.
And how do you respond to the union's position as they underscored a couple of days ago at a media conference outside the AG's office, where they are going to tell their members that you are under no mandate to state your vaccination status, and therefore, I just spoke to the head of one of the unions, the National Health Workers Union, and he said that he's not going to declare his status because it is his personal right. How do you read that?
Well, of course, and by all means, one respects that fully, 100%. However, as the employer, I would also have the right to say, well, unless you are able to demonstrate to me that you are vaccinated, as according to my policy or my legislation, then I will not let you in. So you exercise your right, I exercise my right. And we have a standoff and a face-off and a showdown in the courts. That's where it's going to end.
And in the meantime, Martin Joel, maybe citizens will lose, because if you have a situation where at health facilities, 50% or more, or maybe 30% of those who would normally be on duty are not there, while this is going through the courts or whatever it is, isn't it ultimately the ordinary citizens of Trinidad and Tobago who will suffer from this?
Well, it may or may not be. But look at, for instance, in Texas, the case of Texas versus Bridges, where there was a mandate given to hospital workers, right? And this was a case from last year, 2021. In that matter, right, the court reasoned that forcing the worker, Bridges, to take the vaccine was not coercion, since the hospital was in the business of saving lives without giving them exposure to the COVID-19 virus. So therefore, in those circumstances, as I say, the courts have always upheld vaccination policies. And that's why, I always like to have recourse to the law. So as you mentioned exactly, health workers and hospital workers, I have a case exactly on point, that one of Texas versus Bridges, and that's a case from last year, dealing with the COVID-19 vaccination and mandatory vaccination, and the court in Texas ruled that the hospital was correct to make the vaccination mandatory. So I understand and I certainly respect the very strongly held views of persons who feel, well, look, it's their right not to be vaccinated. I understand that, I respect that. However, if it is that the government brings in legislation to say that, look, you ought to be vaccinated in order to enter the workplace of a government office, I can tell you all the precedents and all the cases seem to support that type of legislation as being something the courts will uphold. We, of course, know that the president of the Industrial Court, Deborah Thomas Felix, she has expressed her view in terms of, how she sees it in terms of employer-employee. However, once the government legislates for it, then that takes it out of the realm of a simple industrial relations issue, because you now have mandatory legislation. So that's why I started off by saying that, it's really sophistry on the part of the government to say it's not mandatory, because it really amounts to that, in effect.
And because as you've presented it, and we appreciate that perspective as far as essentially getting the laws passed, will they require a 3/5 majority and therefore the support of the opposition?
Well, it's not necessarily so from what I have seen, and I haven't heard any argument to suggest that this is going to be an infringement on anyone's constitutional rights. Because the same way for instance, okay, let's look at it simply. You're in the media, right? So let's deal with something that media people are familiar with. The laws of defamation. Those don't require any special majority to be passed in the parliament, and those are in effect. And the laws of defamation do curtail your rights to freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is guaranteed by the Constitution. So in other words, you have freedom of speech that is protected as one of your constitutional rights. However, that freedom of speech does not mean that you can then go about defaming people's character without penalty or without recourse. So even constitutional rights are constrained and are exercised within the framework of the society within which you live. There are limits.
And as a final thought, because we're coming up towards the middle of the month, do you anticipate that if this does become a court matter, that it could in any way be expedited, or is this something that's going to be a drawn-out process from your understanding of how these things work?
Well, if we look at what has happened with all these types of matters, remember there were the cases filed by persons who were locked out of the country. Let's start with that. You realize the courts gave those things priority because of the nature of it, and those were dealt with. And even for those who filed constitutional motions saying that it's their right to be able to enter the country when the borders were closed, you remember the courts ruled against them. They went to appeal, the appeal court heard it expeditiously, and the appeal court upheld the ruling of the High Court to say that it is lawful for the government to be able to do so. So obviously these cases would be expedited and they would be heard quickly because of the nature of them. You don't want something like that hanging on or, in abeyance. So they would be heard quickly.
I hear you on that. Martin Jones, thanks as always for taking the time to offer your perspective. Thank you very much.
It's always a pleasure, Fazil, and a great morning to you and your staff at TV6.
And don't give me any references about jockey shorts again, because I'm still trying to get that image out of my mind. Thanks very much once again, Martin Jones, 7:24 in Trinidad and Tobago. Here we have a couple of images captured in Guayaguayari on New Year's Day. This palm tree right on the edge, and this is another one. Lots of them, just on that cliffside there, heading down towards Galeota, presenting us with these very nice images on New Year's Day 2022. We'll be right back.